The living God, the God who is God and not a philosopher's abstraction, lies infinitely beyond the reach of anything our eyes can see or our minds can understand. No matter what perfection you predicate of him, you have to add that your concept is only a pale analogy of the perfection that is in God, and that he is not literally what you conceive by that term. He who is infinite light is so tremendous in his evidence that our minds only see him as darkness, lux in tenebris lucet, et tenebrae eam non comprehenderunt. The light shines in darkness, and the darkness has not understood it. If nothing that can be seen can either be God or represent him to us as he is, then to find God we must pass beyond everything that can be seen and enter into darkness. Since nothing that can be heard is God, to find him we must enter into silence. Since God cannot be imagined, anything our imagination tells us about him is ultimately misleading, and therefore we cannot know him as he really is unless we pass beyond everything that can be imagined and enter into an obscurity without images and without the likeness of any created thing. And since God cannot be seen or imagined, the visions of God we read of the saints having are not so much visions of him as visions about him. For to see any limited form is not to see him. God cannot be understood except by himself. If we are to understand him, we can only do so by being in some way transformed into him, so that we know him as he knows himself. And he does not know himself by any representation of himself. His own infinite being is his own knowledge of himself, and we will not know him as he knows himself until we are united to what he is. Faith is the first step in this transformation because it is a cognition that knows without images and representations by a loving identification with the living God in obscurity. Faith reaches the intellect not simply through the senses, but in a light directly infused by God. Since this light does not pass through the eye or the imagination or reason, its certitude becomes our own without any vesture of created appearance, without any likeness that can be visualized or described. It is true that the language of the article of faith to which we assent represents things that can be imagined, but insofar as we imagine them, we misconceive them and tend to go astray. Ultimately, we cannot imagine the connection between the two terms of the proposition, "In God there are three persons and one nature," and it would be a great mistake to try. If you believe, if you make a simple act of submission to the authority of God, proposing some article of faith externally through his church, you receive the gift of an interior light that is so simple that it baffles description and so pure that it would be coarse to call it an experience. But it is a true light, perfecting the intellect of man with a perfection far beyond knowledge. It is, of course, necessary to remember that faith implies the acceptance of truths proposed by authority. But this element of submission in faith must not be so overemphasized that it seems to constitute the whole essence of faith, as if a mere unloving, unenlightened, dogged submission of the will to authority were enough to make a man of faith. If this element of will is overemphasized, then the difference between faith in the intellect and simple obedience in the will becomes obscured. In certain cases, this can be very unhealthy, because actually, if there is no light of faith, no interior illumination of the mind by grace, by which one accepts the proposed truth from God and thereby attains to it, so to speak, in His divine assurance, then inevitably the mind lacks the true peace, the supernatural support which is due to it. In that event, there is not real faith. The positive element of light is lacking. There is a forced suppression of doubt rather than the opening of the eye of the heart by deep belief.